based on our review of most of the national publications, despite a long winning streak, despite more talent on the roster as determined by the recruiting rankings over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, despite a number of psychological advantages you would think Ohio State would continue to have over Michigan, the Michigan Wolverines, by most of the major publications, are the favorite. Not a large favorite, usually outranking Ohio State by most of these publications by a spot or 2 or 3 in the national rankings, but being selected as Big Ten champion. Tony, since you served up this topic for tonight, I would like to know what your thought is on Michigan being basically the Big Ten favorite.
Well, I think you begin, whenever you're looking at stuff like this, you begin with, is the quarterback back, and what does the schedule look like? And in the Big Ten East, you're going to look at Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan. And there's only one starting quarterback returning there, and that's Shea Patterson at Michigan. So right there, that gives them the edge. Ohio State goes to Michigan this year. That gives them another edge. However, Michigan has lost a lot, and that goes to, they lost the running backs, Karan Higdon. Chris Evans isn't playing this year. They could be relying on a true freshman running back, and while some teams get away with that, Ohio State did in 2017, it's not the ideal situation. And you look at the defensive losses they have, losing pretty much almost their entire defensive line. Devin Bush at middle linebacker. They lost a corner, lost a safety, and they've really never had the defensive depth that they need, and that always comes out later in the season. Like looking at their last few games every year. In 2018, I was just looking at some stats. I think they gave up over 5 yards per play, 4 times in each of the last 3 games they did it. They were 1-2 in those 3 games. 2017, they lost their last 3 games. They gave up over 5 yards per carry and 4 times that year, and each time in the last 3 games. 2016, they gave up 30 points twice that season in the last 2 games. So when I look at this Michigan defense, they're not a lot of familiar faces, and they have not recruited very well on the defensive line, and they don't really have the depth that it's going to be needed. And when you look at the middle of the line especially, I know they returned defensive tackle Carlo Kemp, but there's not a lot behind him, and he's not much all by himself. I'm not saying he's Jack Cohn, Noon. I'm not saying he's going to be like some.
Well, nobody's that awful.
But I don't know where. Now, I trust Don Brown completely, and I know Indiana and Ohio State have had their way a little bit with him. But we've seen him be able to make a great defense with one returning starter. But the guys coming off the bench were, like Devin Bush was a new starter that year, and I don't see any Devin Bushes. And there's certainly I don't think there's any Chase Winoviches. And the guys that they have played bit parts last year, and they're going to have to be main players this year.
Tony, I would love to get you to weigh in on this. Actually, all 3 of you, before we get to the actual football analysis of this from Steve and from Kevin. And Steve, you can start on this, and then we'll get back to Tony and to Kevin. Is there, aside from the football analysis, any incentive from these publications or anyone out there to make a prediction that may sell a few more magazines?
I don't know how much of it is wanting to sell magazines, because I think the magazines sell with Ohio State on the cover, and you will have some Buckeye fans who won't buy a magazine if there's Michigan players on the cover. So I think it's like I said, it goes back to Shea Patterson as a returning starting quarterback. That's a very important thing, and that's one of the things I look at. Schedule. Ohio State goes to Michigan. That's, when you look at Ohio State's last losses to Michigan, it's been in Ann Arbor. There's not very many of them, but that's where they come from. So you look at Penn State, and I don't think anybody really trusts them right now with all of the losses they've had on offense. So I don't see it as a way to sell magazines or something. It's not shady like the recruiting business, right, Noon?
Exactly. Well, I agree with you in terms of what they're returning. I don't think there's anything nefarious about them trying to sell a couple more magazines that Michigan fans are suddenly going to go out and buy them because they're picked to get there, and that Ohio State fans will be outraged. I mean, Ohio State fans love to be outraged. Don't get me wrong. But with that being said, they do return their quarterback. They have a head coach that has more than a 3-game head coaching tenure as Ryan Day has. They return most of their offensive line. You can't say that about most of the teams of the Big Ten, especially in the East. And, we can debate whether or not, John Runyon is a terrific player. I think Ben Bredesen's pretty good. We could debate Ed Warner and what he's been able to do so far with that line. But everything that they're returning, I understand why maybe the editors of these magazines say that Michigan may be the safe pick. But they also win the September Heisman every year. They always are the team, them and Notre Dame and a couple others out there, that get a lot of the preseason, early season buzz. And I mean, I expected it. I honestly expected Michigan to be ranked ahead of Ohio State in terms of where a lot of these prognosticators were going to be. And, we'll revisit it mid-October and see where things are at that point.
But it's just the simple case that Ohio State has the track record. They do have a more talented roster. I don't think there's any question about that. Is it substantially more talented? Probably not. Decidedly, yes. But Michigan has the key factors of the coach in place, the quarterback in place, the home game. And I think because of the transition, I think that people are looking for an opportunity to say, this streak has to be broken at some point. And if it is broken, Michigan's good enough to win the division with that 1-game advantage over Ohio State head to head. So it has to happen at some point.
Yeah. And I think it's been a while since we've seen them picked. So if it's going to happen, it happens in a year where Ohio State has a new coach, new quarterback, a completely revamped defense, and they're going to Michigan. So, it makes sense to me. But I guess it eventually has to happen, and Michigan will eventually beat Ohio State, and it could be this year. It's just I think what is most interesting is how it's all the magazines. It's consensus that Michigan is going to win the Big Ten, and I haven't checked out Street and Smith's because I'm not a 60-year-old person who lives at a drugstore. And that's, I don't know. I don't know about Street and Smith's. It's not a magazine that I've looked at anymore. But just the consensus that Michigan is the top in the Big Ten, I think is maybe what has struck me most about these projections.
Yeah, Ohio State and Michigan could play each other 10 times this year, and you could come up with, how many does Michigan win? How many does Ohio State win? You only have to play this game once, and you have to win it the one time. And I think a lot of the nation, and I'm not saying that the writers are doing this to placate anybody, but a lot of the nation would probably like to see the rivalry return to a little bit more of a competitive spot than where it is. So, tie may go to the underdog in terms of that, and that's why they may put them there at this point.
Yeah, as soon as you make that comment, Kevin, it brings me back to a place in which when I started the current job that I have, I met a Michigan fan because he was training me, and he was bored of the rivalry. Well, this was the fall of 2001. So he was bored of the rivalry at that point and said it really wasn't a rivalry, and he actually wished it would become a rivalry. And boy, did his wishes come true. And then flip on him to the other side here 18 years later.
If you get bored with it, you deserve what happens to you. That's how I view it. If you're not always about the rivalry and you start to take it for granted, you don't deserve it.
Trial. We may have to testify about
Steve.
Hey, Steve, how are you?
I'm great.
Boy, I'm going to have to carve up this video. Not only has there been all sorts of comments made during our Ohio State discussion by myself in particular about Steve's status and trying to get his mic activated, but also I have lost control of the automatic direction of the camera shots to whomever's talking. So that's lost control as well. So, Steve, regardless, it's good to see you.
I'm glad to be here. I will do my best to try and make this the best roundtable discussion that we can make it.
Well, we've got a lot to make up for then. By no fault of Tony and Kevin's, of course. But Steve, we would love to get your perspective on why all these publications are coming out with Michigan as the Big Ten favorite.
Well, I think they watched Ohio State's spring game and saw how, lack of a better term, how poorly Justin Fields looked. I mean, he completed 4 passes. So, when you go from Dwayne Haskins and everything that he was able to accomplish the last year to now the uncertainty of what the passing game's going to look like, encounter that with the fact that Michigan does have a stud by the name of Shea Patterson, who threw for 2,600 yards and 22 touchdowns last year, has experience. The game's being played in Michigan. I don't know. I mean, I know Michigan's defense was gutted by the NFL. When you talk about guys like Gary, Bush, Winovich, and so on, all leaving, let's see here. They've got them for maybe 4 or 5 returning starters on defense. So, you look at it, I think that is what people are considering, is that Michigan on paper has the better team going into the season. Now, on paper, they had the better team going into the game last year, and Ohio State just absolutely dominated them. So, to the tune of 62 points. So, I think you just have to think about it, take it with a grain of salt, and just understand that that the magazines and the prognosticators are thinking this is finally going to be Michigan's year. They have a senior quarterback playing at home in Michigan, and maybe, just maybe, this will be their year. But I still am of a mind you're going to have to show me before I believe it.
And I think one thing that you touch upon is I'll let Kevin, if you're jumping in, let me just transition to it to you this way. That I think it's not just the Haskins departure, but it's the Haskins departure to Justin Fields, and it's also the what was lacking last year and it not being proven that those things are fixed. And so this isn't that Troy Smith was prolific last year and now he's gone, but the defense was just tremendous and the running game worked and everything else was good. Sure, there might be a drop off at quarterback, but all the rest of the team was top 5 to top 10 caliber. Or the other quarterback transitions we've seen from prolific quarterback seasons in recent past to, okay, there's a bit of a transition here. Maybe it's Braxton Miller, whatever the case might be. But we've seen, okay, the defense was elite and the running game strong, and we have all this. It seemed like Dwayne Haskins carried this team, and I think that was overplayed because it's the ultimate team game. But just the drop off at that position potentially because of the unknown factor, and then just everything else wasn't necessarily fixed. It was remedied and patched up, and it looked better the last few weeks, but it wasn't completely fixed.
Well, just to double back to Steve's point about if they were watching the spring game, and I'm not saying that's where Steve's at. I mean, maybe that they did, but we go back to 2014. It was a 17-7 snooze fest when Braxton Miller was injured and JT Barrett. Granted, the passing was a little further advanced there. 15 of 33 for $151. Cardale Jones was 13 of 29. But if you're watching a glorified scrimmage where you're splitting a team, taking 15 to 20 players out who are having procedures, little things cleaned up, who are not playing in the game, and you're judging some sort of grand decision based on that. I mean, fake news. Fake news big time, because that's just not the way to do it.
What I like about putting stock in the spring game is if a Buckeye, and this goes back 30 years, if a Buckeye has a great spring game, people will dismiss it. But if he has a bad game, then that is the point of fact. This is who he is. And Justin Fields was 4 of 13. But if he, you go back to, we Buckeye fans know, and people who have covered Ohio State know, it's like Bam Childress. That's the name. Spring game MVP every year would look great and then never do anything during the season. So anytime somebody does something good during the spring game, it gets dismissed. And I would like to maybe recommend that some people do that with Justin Fields, because he wasn't live and he is going to run the ball. And quarterbacks, it's not a situation where quarterbacks are going to look good. Now, back to something you were saying, Mark, about the defense and the running game struggling, all of those struggles last year. That's something that I completely I guess I forget about it, because we're kind of entrenched here and seeing and talking to the coaches who are making these changes, and we assume these changes are going to be made. But you're absolutely right. This team couldn't run the ball, had trouble stopping the ball, looked bad at times, giving up big plays all the time. And here, a few minutes away from campus, we see those things being addressed, assuming they will be addressed. Magazines from wherever, written in Chicago, written in Charlotte, written in Atlanta by people who aren't necessarily on the beat, or maybe are on the beat. But it's I guess it's a 30,000 foot view where those things are still issues until, like you said, they aren't, and we don't know that they aren't until we see them on the field. And for me, sometimes I forget that that's sort of the perception of last year's team, even though I talk about it every week on the podcast and write about it all the time. But you assume these changes are going to be made.
Yeah, and with the coaching acumen of the people that are in place, with Greg Madison coming onto the staff as well, and with the recruiting rankings of the players that are on the field, it would just seem to make sense that they will get fixed. But they were supposed to get fixed week to week last year, and they just never did. Again, they played better the last 3 games against Michigan, Northwestern, and Washington defensively, but still weren't anything close to a dominant defense.
But it's hard, and you talk about fixing it from week to week. It's hard to fix your jet engine when you're at 45,000 feet. I mean, at that point, you're kind of a work in progress. And even with the one open week that was on the schedule last year, when you have the same coaching philosophies that are carrying through, and that's not an indictment of Greg Schiano's system or anything along those lines. We can all sit here and question and agree that there were just some odd things with how close the linebackers played the line of scrimmage, some of the pursuit angles, things along those lines. But it's a lot more difficult at that point for the line or for the defense as a whole to fix itself. So, you really want to hope that this year, some new blood, some new ideas, maybe a little bit of a scheme change. If a 4-2-5 becomes a little bit more of a base defense, not as much press quarters, that they will get off to a better start. But I just want to get back to one more thing too, as we sit there and we're ready to anoint Michigan Big Ten East champions, send them to Indianapolis, tell them about the shrimp cocktail at St. Elmo, all the trappings there. Who's going to run the ball for them? I mean, Chris Evans is suspended for the year. They have a back who ran a little bit against Florida in their annual bowl game against Florida, their annual bowl loss against Florida. They have a redshirt freshman, and then they have a 3-star but relatively well-regarded running back coming in who will be a true freshman as well. Shea Patterson better be able to do everything, because at this point I don't see anybody on the team that's going to be able to run the ball with any consistency.
Yeah, I think their offense is probably going to pick up a little bit, other than, as you mentioned, the running game is kind of a question. I think that they could have a dynamic passing attack, but again, one kind of feeds off of the other. As I look at the Phil Steele book right here, they've got 8 returning starters on offense and 5 on defense. So, if they can solve, as you said, the running back position and find a workable running back, maybe that would be kind of the last piece of the puzzle for them. And at times last year, they were pretty good. I mean, they put 42 on Penn State, had some really big games at times. And so I want to see, again, in the early portion of their season, I want to see how they've solved this, because if they can't run the ball effectively when they want and need to run the ball effectively, they're going to be in a lot of close games.
Yeah, the
And-
running game at Michigan is always key, but it's looking to be less key this year than it has been at maybe any other time because of the approach on offense that they're taking. But it's going to be key in November against the better teams down the stretch.